After being spared the death penalty and sentenced instead to 3 life terms, Paul Warner Powell thought he had beaten the system. He was 20 years old, locked away in prison, and convinced that the worst was behind him. But Powell wasn't just a murderer. He was arrogant, cruel, and proud of what he had done. From his cell, he picked up a pen and wrote a letter, not only to the prosecutor who had overseen his case, but also to the grieving family of his victims. In that letter, Powell mocked them, he taunted them, and worst of all, he revealed chilling new details about how he committed his crimes, details prosecutors hadn't been able to prove during his first trial. Powell believed he was untouchable. He thought double jeopardy protected him from ever facing death again. What he didn't realize was that his own words would become the weapon used against him. His arrogance gave prosecutors exactly what they needed to put him back on trial, this time with no escape. Welcome to True Crime Matter. Today, we're diving into the disturbing story of Paul Warner Powell, the racist killer whose own bragging letter dragged him from a prison cell all the way to Virginia's death row. On January 29, 1999, in Manassas, Virginia, an ordinary suburban afternoon turned into a nightmare that would scar a family forever. Inside a modest home, 20-year-old Paul Warner Powell waited for an opportunity he had been fantasizing about for months. Powell was no stranger to the Reed family. He had been friends with Stacy Reed, a bright teenage girl with her whole future ahead of her. But in Powell's twisted mind, friendship was never enough. He wanted control. He wanted possession. And when he discovered that Stacy was dating someone who was black, it ignited the hatred he carried inside. Powell, by his own words, was a self-avowed racist, a young man who openly bragged about his white supremacist beliefs. That winter afternoon, Powell confronted Stacy inside her home. She was just 16 years old, still a child to her family, but old enough to know exactly what she wanted and what she did not. Stacy had rejected Powell's advances before, and she rejected them again that day. But this time, his anger boiled over. He forced himself on her, attempting to overpower her. Stacy fought back with everything she had, but Powell's rage would not be denied. In a violent outburst, he grabbed a knife and plunged it into her chest. The blade tore into her heart. Within seconds, Stacy collapsed. Her life was over. And then came one of the most chilling details of this crime. Powell didn't run. He didn't panic. Instead, he made himself at home in the very place where he had just killed a young girl. He poured himself a glass of iced tea. He lit a cigarette. He sat calmly as if nothing had happened, waiting for his next victim to walk through the door. Not long after, the sound of footsteps echoed across the floorboards. It was Christy Reed, Stacy's younger sister, returning from school. Unaware of what had happened upstairs, she walked straight into Powell's trap. He ordered her down into the basement, his voice cold and commanding. Once there, Powell subjected her to a brutal assault. As Christy endured the horror, a knock at the front door interrupted Powell. Someone had arrived at the house, forcing him to quickly cover his tracks. He dressed, tied Christy up, and went upstairs to deal with the interruption. In those moments, Christy saw her chance. With trembling hands, she worked desperately at the knots around her wrists, trying to break free. Somehow she managed to loosen the bindings. She tried to hide. She tried to escape. But before she could find safety, Powell returned. What followed was even more savage. Powell ripped Christy's glasses from her face, robbing her of her vision. Then, in a calculated act of cruelty, he wrapped his hands around her throat and strangled her until her body went limp. Believing she was unconscious, he raised his knife again. This time, he drove the blade into her stomach. The wound came within a single centimeter of her aorta, so close to death that doctors would later call her survival a miracle. Still not finished, Powell dragged the knife across her neck, slashing her again and again. By the time he was done, Christy's body was covered in wounds, across her neck, her abdomen, her wrists. Later, surgeons would count more than 60 stitches needed to close the cuts on her throat alone. Powell left her there in the basement, assuming she would bleed out and die just like her sister upstairs. But fate had other plans. At around 4:15 p.m., Robert Culver, the girl's stepfather, walked through the front door. What he saw first was Stacy's lifeless body on the floor. His heart stopped. He rushed to find a phone, desperate to call for help. Then, searching the house in panic, he opened the basement door. There, he discovered a scene of horror no parent should ever witness. Christy lay on the floor, her clothes soaked in blood, her neck slashed, her body trembling but alive. Somehow, despite the violence she had endured, she clung to life. Robert called for help, and Christy was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save her. They stitched together her neck, patched the stab wounds, and stabilized her fragile body. Against all odds, she survived. The scars remained. Long, deep, and permanent, they carved across her skin like a reminder of that afternoon. But Christy was more than a survivor. She was the key witness. When the time came, she walked into court, stood before the man who had tried to kill her, and testified about everything he had done. Her words were steady, her resolve unshakable. The strength of a teenage girl became the voice that ensured Paul Warner Powell could not hide from what he had done. That day in Manassas, Powell thought his hate made him powerful, but the survival of Christy Reed turned his act of cruelty into the very evidence that would bring him to justice. Before the day of the crime, he was just a boy growing up in West Virginia, born on April 13, 1978, in Virginia. By his teenage years, he had already developed a reputation for being violent, reckless, and openly racist. Those who knew him described him as a self-proclaimed white supremacist who despised interracial relationships and often spoke proudly of his hatred. Powell dropped out of high school, drifting between low-paying jobs and spending much of his time drinking, smoking, and bragging about his extremist views. He was fascinated by violence and weapons, carrying knives and talking tough to impress peers. Beneath the bravado, though, he was directionless and bitter, blaming others for his failures. His fixation on Stacy Reed, a teenager in his neighborhood, became twisted by his prejudice when he learned her boyfriend was black. That discovery stoked his rage and ultimately set in motion the horrific crimes that would later define him and ensure that his name would forever be linked to hate, brutality, and one of Virginia's most chilling murder cases. He was charged to court in early 2000, and what unfolded was one of Virginia's most complicated capital murder cases. Prosecutors accused Paul Warner Powell of killing 16-year-old Stacy Reed in January 1999 and brutally attacking her younger sister Christy. The evidence was damning: blood, eyewitness testimony from Christy, and Powell's own admissions. Yet the trial quickly revealed legal complications. Initially, Powell was indicted for capital murder, but under Virginia law at the time, the capital charge required that Stacy's murder be connected to another felony, such as sexual assault. Prosecutors believed Powell had killed her to cover up his attempted assault, but forensic evidence could not fully prove that element. In August 2000, Powell was convicted not of capital murder, but of first-degree murder. He received 3 life sentences plus additional decades for the other crimes, a punishment that kept him in prison but spared him the death penalty. That could have been the end of it, until Powell himself intervened. From behind bars, he grew arrogant and smug. In 2001, he wrote to the prosecutor, "Since I have already been indicted on first-degree murder and the Supreme Court said that I can't be charged with capital murder again, I figured I would tell you the rest of what happened on Jan. 29, 1999, to show you how stupid all of y'all are," wrote Powell, narrating how he carried out the crime. He said he had gone to the Reed house to confront Stacy for dating a black boyfriend. He was a known white supremacist. He admitted pinning the victim, threatening to rape her, then stabbing her in the heart when the girl resisted. He then stomped on her throat. With his confession, the prosecutor had a case against him. The second trial in 2003 was decisive. This time, the jury heard everything: Christy's testimony, forensic evidence, and Powell's own incriminating words. The result was a death sentence. The jury convicted him of capital murder, and Powell was sentenced to death. He was transferred to Virginia's death row at Sussex Thor State Prison, where he would spend the next several years awaiting execution. On death row, Powell became notorious for his defiance. He continued to appeal his sentence, arguing that double jeopardy should have protected him, and that the state had violated his constitutional rights. The case climbed through multiple courts, but each ruling affirmed his death sentence. In 2004, the Virginia Supreme Court upheld the conviction, and in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. For Powell, the end was sealed. As his execution date approached, Virginia law gave him a choice between lethal injection and the electric chair, a relic of an older era. In a final show of defiance, Powell rejected the more modern method and chose electrocution. It was both a grim statement and a chilling way to control the narrative of his death. With that decision, all that remained was to set the date when justice would finally be carried out. In the final hours, Paul Warner Powell remained silent, just as he'd been throughout much of the legal limbo. The day before his execution, however, he made a rare gesture toward remorse. According to the Reed family, Powell called them and said the crime was a senseless and pointless thing, adding simply, "I'm sorry." But when the moment came for final words from the death chamber, Powell gave none. As he was strapped into the oak electric chair at Greensville Correctional Center, surrounded by guards and witnesses, he stared silently at the ceiling. Not a whisper, not a regret, just a calm, emotionless gaze upward. Details like his last meal weren't disclosed by authorities, leaving that small question unanswered. His silence, however, spoke volumes. At precisely 9:09 p.m. on March 19, 2010, the current surged through. The warden flipped the switch. Powell's body jerked, the air filled with the smell of scorched cloth. Minutes later, the warden listened for any heartbeat. None came. Paul Warner Powell was pronounced dead. The curtain fell on a case marked by brutality, arrogance, a survivor's resilience, and a final cold silence.